So hopefully some of these things are surprising to you as well, and maybe even a little bit entertaining, because that's kind of what I'm going for here. And maybe, just maybe, they'll help you view CSS in a different light. So first, I should probably introduce myself. Hi, I'm Mathias. I work for Opera Software in developer relations, and before that, I used to freelance as a front-end web developer. So I've basically been using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for, ever since I started working. I like web standards, programming in general, web security, and I love working on open source projects as well. Now, my Twitter handle is simply my first name, so if you have any questions at all during the talk, feel free to just mention me on Twitter, and I'll be sure to get back to you. Of course, there's also going to be a little bit of time for questions after the talk. Now, let's start off with everyone's absolutely favorite CSS feature, important, or as you would say in Nantes, important, right? So I'm sure you're all familiar with what important does. In a situation like this, for example, all the elements with class bar get a green color, but all the elements with class bar within an element with class foo would get a red color. And this is what that would look like. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new here. So whenever there's a conflict between two selectors in CSS, usually the one in the source code that is at the bottom wins, the last one in the source code. However, in this case, the specificity for these two selectors is different. And because of that, the one with the highest specificity wins, regardless of the order in the source code. So here, the specificity of the first selector with two class selectors in it is higher than the specificity of the last one, which is why it wins. And that's why the color is red instead of green. And that's why important exists. In some situations, you may need to override an earlier rule set. So in this case, if you want all elements with class bar to be green, despite of that earlier CSS rule at the top, you can use important to boost a single declaration's precedence. And indeed, this works. Now, so far, I probably haven't told you anything you didn't already know. But what really surprised me here is that important actually has nothing to do with specificity. It's actually a completely different thing. It boosts a single declaration's precedence without actually affecting the specificity for the whole selector. So, however, you may have heard that the use of important is kind of a bad practice. You shouldn't really use it. Now, luckily, we can fake it. There's a way to use important without actually using important itself. Instead of boosting the declaration's precedence, we can simply increase the selector specificity instead. So all we have to do is basically repeat that class name in the last selector a couple of hundred times. And every time you repeat the class name, you boost the selector specificity a little bit. So if you just do that enough times, eventually it's going to win anyway. And just to show you that I didn't just make this up, this actually works. So let's fake important and repeat the class name a couple of times. Oh, just once is enough. OK, the color is green. So there you go, your first new best practice of the day. Well, not really. OK, let's talk about font family names in CSS. Raise your hand if you've ever heard this before. If there's white space in a font family name, you should quote it. Yeah, some of you are a little bit too shy, but I can tell you want to raise your hand secretly on the inside. Now, for a very long time, I've lived by this mantra because the W3C CSS validator would actually show this as a warning if you would forget the quotes. Now, actually, it turns out that this is not really accurate. It turns out it doesn't really make sense because spaces are not problematic in font family names at all. If the font family name is a space-separated set of CSS identifiers, then no quotes are needed at all. The CSS will still be valid and will still work in every browser. Now, if you're interested in the exact rules and details about this, you can check out the URL right there. But I'm just going to simplify it a little bit for you in this slide. So here we can simply omit the quotes if you want to use Comic Sans MS, and you would get the exact same result. There are other things that are much more dangerous in font family names than just spaces. For example, let's say you have a font family name that starts with a digit, with a number. A font named 456 Beria Street would be an example. Now, because it starts with a digit, it is not a valid CSS identifier anymore. So this CSS is actually invalid, and it wouldn't actually work. The font wouldn't be applied. So how can we fix this? Well, we can make it a valid identifier by escaping the first digit in the name. And that would look something like this. So if you remember, the name of the font is 456 Beria Street, but now it looks like 3, 4, 5, 6 Beria Street in our code, and there's this backslash, and there's this weird space in between, and it's just super, super weird and annoying and confusing. This is not the kind of code you want to write or even read. So there's, of course, an easier way to fix it, and that is, of course, to use quotes. Just wrap it in quotes. So when in doubt, I think you should just always use quotes, not just for font family names in CSS, but elsewhere as well. But the point is, the thing I learned here is that there is no need to use quotes just because of white space. White space is not going to be a problem at all. Now, because I really wanted to understand all these weird little rules in the CSS standard, I've made a tool for this. So you can enter any font family name in there, and it will tell you if it would make sense to use quotes or not. Now let's take a closer look at attribute values in HTML and CSS. As I'm sure you know, in both HTML and CSS, you can use quotes around attribute values. So here we have an anchor named an anchor element with an href of foo. And in the CSS style block, we then select that same element based on its attribute value, and then we give it a nice hot pink background. Now, in some cases, like in this example, you can just omit those quotes in HTML and in CSS, and everything still works. The HTML is still valid, the CSS is still valid, it just works. No problems there at all. However, and this is another thing that surprised me, it's important to note that the rules for unquoted attribute values are different between CSS and HTML. In this example, the HTML is perfectly valid when the value is foo pipe bar, but the CSS is invalid and it won't actually work. So this rule will silently be ignored. There won't be any hot pink in this example. So how do you fix this? Well, once again, it's really simple. All you need to do is just use the quotes. And in this case, it's only really required for the CSS example, but of course you could just do it for HTML as well. And my recommendation would be to just always use quotes whenever you can around attribute values, because it just avoids all these issues and it makes you think less about all these weird problems and edge cases. Really, I wanted to understand this, so all these differences between HTML and CSS were really intriguing to me. So I've built another tool. You can enter any value and it will tell you if it can be used as an unquoted attribute value in HTML or in CSS. And as you can see, sometimes the result is actually different. Okay, next up is CSS comments. As you probably know, this is the only comment syntax that CSS supports. A comment block starts with a slash followed by an asterisk, and it ends with an asterisk followed by a slash. And anything in between those two things will be part of a comment, including new lines and stuff like that. And that's why this example works the way you expect it to. You don't want the color red declaration to be applied, so this way it will just be ignored. Yay, this works. Now, lots of other programming languages, they have a single line comment syntax as well, usually using 2 slashes, as you can see here. But CSS doesn't have the concept of single line comments at all. So this is actually invalid CSS. However, what surprised me here is that this example will still work the way you intend it to work. You want color red to be ignored, and effectively this line will not be executed at all. So what's the deal here? What's going on? Well, property names in CSS are supposed to be valid CSS identifiers, and identifiers cannot contain unescaped slashes. So because of that, this one rule, the color :red thing, it fails to parse because of the slashes, and the CSS just skips it and moves on with the next rule. Now, if the property name was a valid identifier, then the CSS would get parsed just fine. However, rules for unknown properties are silently ignored. So this gives us another way to fake a single line comment in CSS. We could just translate the property name to French, couleur red, and that would also be ignored because no browser supports that. Or you could just make a few typos in the property name. That would also work. And that's kind of crazy, and you should probably never deliberately do this, but it actually works in the sense that the rule is silently ignored. So Tab Atkins has an excellent blog post that explains these tricks, and it's a really good way to learn a little bit about CSS grammar and how CSS error handling works. I thought that was pretty interesting. There's something else that's related to CSS that I would like to show you, but before I can do that, we need to talk about HTML tags for a little while. Does anyone know the difference between HTML tags and elements? Okay, not a lot of confident people in the audience, I like it. So Tags are the things in your code editor that you type when you're working on an HTML document. So for example, if you have a paragraph, you could choose to open that using a start p tag, and then you can close the p tag at the end of the paragraph. But as soon as that document is opened by the browser, it will parse that HTML and turn it into a document object model. And at that point, as soon as the browser renders it, we no longer think in terms of start and end tags, we think in terms of elements. And these elements are what you deal with in the browser. These elements are what you can style with CSS and what you can access using JavaScript. Not tags, but elements. So that's pretty much the difference. And just to give you an example of that, here's a very simple HTML document. I'm using the HTML5 doc type here, but what I'm about to say is valid for HTML4 and even HTML2 as well. So you can see the HTML and the head and the body tags there. Well, the first thing that surprised me here is that it turns out you can just omit their closing tags. So we just remove those, and then we end up with this document, and this is still valid HTML, and it still works exactly the same way. That's kind of weird, right? Well, it gets even better, because then I learned that you can also remove their start tags. So you can just remove HTML head and body altogether, then you end up with this very compact and minimal document, but it's still valid HTML, and it will still render exactly the same way in all browsers. Now, it's important to note here that the HTML head and the body elements will still be there in the DOM, even though they're not there as tags in the source code. And that's because these elements are implied. Browsers will automatically create these for you, even if they're missing from the markup. So with that in mind, this is probably the most useless tattoo ever. I mean, if you're going to get an HTML tattoo, you should probably pick some tags that aren't implicit, right? Okay, so that minimal HTML document that I just showed you kind of got me thinking, how far can we really take this? What can we remove from our HTML source code if we stop caring about what's valid and what isn't? And then I came across Martin Cole's experiment called No JavaScript. So he attempted to recreate a game using CSS only. His goal was to use no JavaScript at all and almost no HTML. And in fact, this is the full HTML source code for his project. It's just one line. It's just a link tag where he includes a style sheet onto the page, and that's it. Everything else is CSS. And really, you should check this demo out for yourself. The URL is right there at the bottom. But just to give you a quick demo, this is kind of what it looked like. So remember, this is all CSS. And I'm not sure if you can see this, but my mouse cursor is there at the bottom. It's moving to the left and to the right. And there's this spaceship that is following my cursor, which seems easy enough to do if you can use JavaScript. But if you want to do it using only CSS, it gets a bit trickier than that. Now, the elements that are being styled here are the ones that we talked about before, the ones that are not part of the source code, but that the browser creates anyway, like HTML, head, and body. Then there's also that one link element that he had in the source code, in his tags. And of course, the link and the head elements, they are invisible by default, so there's not a lot of styling you can do with them. But you can simply apply display block to them to make them visible, and then you can give them a width, apply a background image to them, and do whatever you want with them. So what you're looking at is just 4 elements: HTML, head, link, and body. 4 elements, and then if you use the before and after pseudo elements as well, that becomes 12 unique stylable blocks. Just 12 stylable blocks, and that's enough to create this. It's kind of crazy, right? I was really impressed when I saw this. So I wanted to create a demo of my own, and this was before I had seen this amazing game. So warning, my demo is not nearly as impressive as this one. This is what it looks like. Wow. Now, it looks very simple, right? But if you were to see this on a random website, you would probably think it was some basic HTML with some really simple CSS applied to it. And so would I. But actually, if you view the source code for this page, you'll find that it's completely empty. There's nothing in there. It's an empty HTML file. So what is going on there? How can I still make text appear and somehow style it? Well, this is what's going on. If you view the HTTP headers for this document, you'll see that the content length is in fact 0, so I'm not cheating there. It's actually an empty file, but I'm using the link HTTP header. And this is a fairly obscure feature, but basically the link HTTP header can be used to do anything the link tag in HTML can in browsers that support it. And at the moment, only Firefox supports the link HTTP header. Opera used to support it before we switched to Blink. But at the moment, Firefox is the only browser to support it. So if you want to try this demo, be sure to do it in Firefox. So anyway, this gives us a completely empty HTML document that still gets some CSS applied to it. So the next step is to make the document look like it contains some actual text, right? And for this, I use the CSS content property. So I select the body element that is automatically created for me by the browser. I don't have to use any tags or markup for that at all. And then I target the after pseudo element and then give it some content just using CSS. And that is how this demo, without any HTML source code at all, works. It's pure CSS and one small HTTP header. So is this useful? I'm not sure. Maybe you could use it to prank your colleagues or something like that. Or if you're really evil, it allows for a very amusing interview question. So someone is interviewing at your company. You give this interview candidate a URL, tell them to open it in Firefox, and that URL points to an HTML page like this with some inline SVG, for example, that displays a circle. And the circle's fill attribute is set to red. That's when you ask the candidate, why is the circle green instead of red? It's probably going to take them a very long time to realize that there's some secret CSS file that magically gets applied to this document. Because if you inspect it in the DevTools, the styles that are applied won't even show up there. It's kind of crazy, so good luck with that. Now, I would like to talk about Unicode in CSS for a little bit, but before we can do that, we probably should talk about Unicode in HTML as well. So let's talk about classes and IDs. The first thing you should know is that the class attribute accepts every possible Unicode character. No matter what Unicode symbol you use in there, it will always be valid. And it will work in every browser as well. So for example, 404-error is a valid class name. That's probably not very surprising. But you could use the copyright sign as a class name for an element containing a legal disclaimer, for example. Now, what's new in HTML5 in the spec is that the same thing now goes for ID attributes. So other than space characters, every symbol, every Unicode symbol at all can be used as an ID. So you could use the heart symbol as an ID for a paragraph, or you could use actual quotation marks as a class name for a block quote element. You can use all kinds of stuff. You can even use hidden emoji to passive-aggressively tell people they're using a shitty browser. And this is all valid HTML. Now, this also means that we can do stuff like this, where you give an element an ID of hash ID, or a class of .class. Or you could even combine the two and then add colon hover braces at the end. Or even use a value that resembles an attribute selector. This is all just valid HTML. And of course, the problem here is these things already look like they're CSS selectors, so how are we going to select these elements based on their IDs and classes in CSS? Well, the answer is we need to escape these values first so that they become valid identifiers. And there's that word again. So only then we can use them as part of a CSS selector. And this is what that would look like. So the hash symbol, for example, has special meaning in CSS, obviously, so it cannot be used as it is. We need to escape it, and that can be done just by making it \hash. The same thing goes for the dot character. That becomes \dot. And the colon character needs escaping too, and theoretically it can be escaped using \:, but that doesn't work in old versions of Internet Explorer, so a more compatible way of escaping it is by using its code point value from Unicode. And that would be \3a followed by a space. That looks kind of weird, but the space is actually part of the escape sequence. That's how they work in CSS. Now, anyway, as you can see, many characters need escaping. But take a look at that last example, an element with ID 404-error. Well, because that ID starts with a digit, it needs to be escaped as well. And I remember that this really surprised me at some point because I was trying to style an element like that and I was wondering why it didn't work. I thought I had found a browser bug at first, but then all browsers seemed to be doing the same thing, and it seemed to be impossible to style this element in CSS. But yeah, you just have to escape it like this. And then it starts to look a little weird again, because 404 error now looks like 3404 error. There's a \, there's a space again. It looks a little bit weird, but you know. So that's one thing I learned. If you ever need to style an element whose class or ID starts with a digit, I'm sure you'll remember this presentation and think back on this moment. Now, what about all those other non-ASCII Unicode symbols? Well, you can just use them without escaping them at all, because they don't have any special meaning in CSS. Now, you could still escape them if you really wanted to, but it's just not necessary. And to help me understand all this, I built a tool that allows you to enter any ID or class name, even the crazy ones, and then it will automatically tell you how you can escape that and select that element in CSS, or using the selectors API in JavaScript. So if, for example, you want to use jQuery to select elements like that, it will give you that syntax as well. Now, nowadays, there's a standardized utility method for this in the form of a JavaScript API, and this is called css.escape. It's part of the CSS object model specification, and it's already available in Opera, Chrome, and Firefox. Now, for other browsers, there's a polyfill available, so you can already start using this today if you need it. This way it works everywhere, even in IE6 if you still need to support that. Now, the thing is, you probably need this feature much more often than you would think. Let me give you some examples of that. I'm sure many of you have done something like this at some point. So I know I have. So you read the hash from the URL, and then you want to use that hash to select the element with that ID from the DOM and then do something with that element. This is fairly common if you're using a tabs widget on your page, for example, and you want to display that tab when the page loads, something like that. Now, what if the location hash contains a space, for example? Remember, the location hash is something that the user has control over, so they can change it. Someone can create a link, and when someone clicks it, your site would break for that user. You probably don't want that to happen, right? So the entire meaning of the selector would be changed if the location hash contains a space, for example, because then it would become a descendant selector rather than just one ID-based selector. And here's another example. So you're basically constructing a selector here dynamically by using some variable. And what if this some value variable contains a double quote, for example? It would automatically break out of the attribute selector there, and it would break the selector, which might end up with a JavaScript error being thrown. This is probably not something you want. So both these examples are actually broken in a subtle way, but it's not really that obvious to see that. Now, luckily, we can fix it, and it's fairly simple to fix it, actually. You just need to wrap the variable parts of these selectors within css.escape. And that makes your code more robust, more secure, and it just makes it work the way it should. So now that we're on the subject of breaking things using malformed CSS selectors, let's take a look at how CSS can be used for evil. Now, first we need to talk about cross-site scripting, or XSS. Has anyone ever heard of that before? Yeah, a lot of people. Well, even if you have heard of it, I recommend checking out Google's cross-site scripting game. It's a great way to learn about how these cross-site scripting attacks work and how you can exploit them yourself. And if you just give this a try for a couple of minutes, you'll be surprised how simple it really is to be able to hack a website this way. Now, most websites nowadays, they display user-supplied content in different contexts within an HTML document. So here, a custom user color is inserted in the context of a CSS value. The username is also inserted in an HTML text context as part of a paragraph element. The username is inserted in an HTML text context, and the user profile is injected in a quoted HTML attribute value. The user ID is inserted in a JavaScript context on the right-hand side of a variable declaration, and finally, some server-generated debug information is inserted into an HTML comment there at the bottom. Now, all of these things are variable content, which can be controlled or at least influenced by the user. And the website that displays this information needs to make sure that the user input is properly sanitized and escaped for the context that it gets inserted into. Now, that's the main problem with security and with protection against cross-site scripting attacks. Each of these 5 different contexts requires its own form of escaping. So usually web application hackers look for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, which enable them to execute custom JavaScript payloads in the context of the targeted website. So once they have such a vulnerability, they can pretty much do anything they want in JavaScript. So the hacker could add a script that listens for keyboard events and then logs anything the victim enters and sends it over to the attacker server, for example, which would essentially be a keylogger. or sensitive information could just be read from the DOM directly. For example, if you're logged into your bank, you're viewing your statements, it could just select all that data, send it over to the attacker server, and yeah, they basically would steal your data that way. So that's why attackers usually go for cross-site scripting attacks, 'cause they're super powerful. But this is not a JavaScript presentation, it's a CSS presentation. So let's change the perspective here. So as a hacker, what's the worst you can do if you have full control over the CSS of a page, but nothing else? Let's think about that for a second. So in other words, what if all these injections are sanitized and escaped properly, except for the first one? So for the sake of the example, let's assume that there is some sort of sanitation going on there that makes it impossible to close the script, to close the style tag. So there's no way for you to inject arbitrary HTML, but you can inject all the CSS you want. What damage can you do with this as an evil hacker? Well, let's see. Does anyone remember the CSS Zen Garden? Yeah. If you don't, just Google CSS Zen Garden and you'll end up on this website. And it's basically one HTML file. It's the same HTML file for everyone. And the idea is that you can provide your own CSS file to style that HTML. And there's a lot of examples. There's over 200 different designs nowadays. You can add your own if you want to. And it basically just showcases the power of CSS. Like this design looks completely different than the first one, but the HTML is exactly the same, only the CSS file has changed. There's over 200 designs, they all look beautiful and completely different, and the only thing that's changing is the CSS. It's a very powerful demonstration of what CSS can do. Now, if you look at this from the perspective of an evil hacker, well, imagine having that kind of power over a website that you're attacking. The obvious thing to do as an evil hacker is to completely deface the website. You could potentially just hide all the existing content and then apply a background image to the whole document or something with your own text in there. And that way you can have your own content on a website that you hacked just by using CSS. Now, I'm not going to show you an example of defaced websites, but I'm sure you can imagine what that would look like. But there's actually another thing you could do, which is similar to defacing, but it's a bit more subtle. And it's even worse if you ask me. You wouldn't touch the design, you would just inject some very annoying CSS rules. And there's a project that collects rules like that. It's called Evil CSS. And it's just a CSS file with a bunch of really annoying and bad for performance CSS rules. So just to give you an example, here's the original DevFest website. Looks great. And here's that same website with evil.css enabled. So there's now extra scroll bars everywhere. The layout is slightly broken. Some of the content is just missing or flickering. It appears and reappears and disappears. It's super weird. The text is also slightly blurry. I'm not sure if you can see this on the projection. Scrolling also feels really slow because they inject a bunch of rules that are bad for performance just for the fun of it. And my absolute favorite part is that the first letter in every element is slightly smaller than all the other ones, like just a little bit. Oh, it's so annoying. Now, anyway, both defacing and doing this sort of thing to a website is annoying for the administrators and the people who run the website, but also for the visitors. But it could be much worse, right? Because with cross-site scripting, sensitive data could be stolen. Well, is such a thing possible with CSS? Let's take a look. Well, it turns out that it is kind of possible to leak data from the DOM using CSS. Some attribute values contain security-sensitive information, right? So if you were a hacker or an attacker and you wanted to steal this value attribute right there, using nothing but CSS injection, how would you go about it? Well, one way to do it is to use the CSS attribute starts with selector. So this way, it's trivial to figure out the first character of this attribute value, of this token. You could just brute force it. You could try every possible value, every possible character, until you find the right one. When you find the right one, the matching background image will be loaded from your server, from the hacker server, and as soon as that request is being made, well, you can just check your logs and you know which letter it was. As soon as you find out the first letter, you can repeat the same thing for the second letter until you have the whole token. So this is a brute force approach. And in the worst case scenario, you could enumerate all the possible values for the CSRF token. But in practice, you don't need to try that many attempts, really. Here's a proof of concept for this sort of attack. So I enter some secret value. Remember, this page doesn't use any JavaScript at all. It's all just pure CSS. A lot of CSS rules, actually. And it's not very efficient or fast, but it shows that it's still possible to extract data from the DOM using nothing but CSS and exfiltrate it to an attacker's server. But still, it could be much worse, right? There could be an efficient way to leak data, like we have with cross-site scripting. It's a good thing we don't have any of that in CSS, right? Well, we actually kind of do. If we take a small trip down memory lane, IE5 introduced this proprietary feature called CSS expressions to make it possible to dynamically calculate the values for CSS properties. And this feature was supported up until IE7. Now, even if you haven't seen this before, if you just look at the syntax closely, you'll note that the code wrapped in the expression part is actually just JavaScript. So yeah, CSS expressions are basically a way to run JavaScript in your CSS. It's a great idea. I'm not sure what can possibly go wrong. Now, one of the use cases that Microsoft had in mind when they came up with CSS expressions was this example, where an element is centered both horizontally and vertically using just a few lines of CSS. So this is basically Flexbox avant la lettre or something like that, which is nice, but maybe it's just a little bit too powerful to give full JavaScript access from within your CSS. Because it's just JavaScript, which means you can do things like this as well. You can use browser-specific JavaScript methods as well, like alert to show an alert box. This would work. It would look something like this. So it's basically a way to introduce cross-site scripting attacks through nothing but CSS, which is a whole new attack vector. And similarly, I mean, this is just an alert box. It's annoying at most, but of course you could use, you could do something else. You can do some real damage by, for example, opening a new window with a phishing site that pretends to be the original site and then tricks the user into entering their password, for example. It could happen using nothing but CSS. Now, you may be thinking, okay, this really sucks, but if it only affects IE7 and older versions of IE, then what's the big deal? Not a lot of people use IE7 anymore, and I don't really support those browsers anymore, so why should I care? Well, the thing is, Internet Explorer has this thing called browser modes, and the last 4 major IE releases, they each shipped with these multiple rendering engines that emulated the bugs in old IE versions. And their F12 developer tools allow you to easily switch between them for testing purposes. But it's also possible to trigger a specific rendering mode for your website by using an HTTP header or an HTML meta element. And the meta tag on this slide ensures that your document is rendered using the latest available rendering mode, which as a developer is usually what you would want. In IE11, it will make sure you use IE11 rendering. In IE10, it will use IE10, and so on. So for every new website that you create, this is probably what you want. But for legacy reasons, for backwards compatibility with old websites, this meta tag could also be used in this way, where you basically enable the IE7 rendering, even in IE11. And the thing is, this mode not only emulates the known bugs that IE7 used to have, but it also brings back removed and deprecated features, such as CSS expressions. So yeah, this way, just by adding this one meta tag to your page, you can use CSS expressions in IE10 as well. You can even use it in IE11 too, but in that case, the site needs to be in a so-called trusted zone, so it's a little bit harder there. That's why I didn't include it in the title. So, okay, yeah, that's pretty cool. We can use CSS expressions to basically execute JavaScript from CSS in IE10 or even IE11 sometimes. But it requires us to add this line of code to the HTML. And in our attack scenario from before, there was no way for us to inject any HTML. Because if we can inject HTML, we could just inject a script tag as well and use cross-site scripting, which is much simpler than this. So given those limitations, how can we still make use of this trick? If we have our target website, we can inject any CSS we want, but we can't inject that meta tag. How can we still attack that website? Well, turns out that there's another trick. As a hacker, you could create a web page of your own, host it on your own server, and trigger IE7 compatibility mode there. And then you would embed the targeted website with the CSS payload inside of an iframe. And in that case, the document mode of the parent document would be inherited by the targeted website in the iframe, even if the targeted website would specify to use the latest available rendering mode. So this allows you to override the rendering mode used within the iframe. So this allows the attacker to use CSS expressions in the context of the target website, even in IE10, which is kind of crazy if you ask me. So to recap, there's two different conditions here. If a target website allows you to inject arbitrary CSS and it allows framing, then this enables you to perform a cross-site scripting attack on your site in Internet Explorer using nothing but CSS. That's kind of crazy if you ask me. So as a developer or a website administrator, how can we make sure that our site doesn't fall prey to these CSS expression vulnerabilities? Well, of course, all of this can be avoided if you just sanitize all the entrusted input before injecting it into your responses. So all you have to do is never ever make a single mistake and everything will be fine. Yeah, sure, like that's going to happen, right? Failing that, you could add the Xframe options HTTP header to your page to prohibit framing of it. And this makes it impossible for an attacker to easily kick your site into IE7 compatibility mode and thereby bring back support for CSS expressions. Last but not least, and this was really surprising to me, if you use the so-called HTML5 doc type, like the short one, then IE will use that as a heuristic to determine that the page doesn't need support for CSS expressions. So even if your page gets framed and inherits the IE7 document mode, if IE sees this doc type, they will disable support for CSS expressions altogether. And this is the only doc type that has this effect. So if you get a chance, like if you have a lot of ancient old web pages that you don't maintain anymore, but they use a different doc type, you could do a simple search replace on that, replace it with this doc type. It won't have any other effects other than making those pages more secure. It's a very simple trick. So this is kind of crazy to think about. I mean, you need to add an HTTP header and use a specific doc type in your HTML just to prevent people from running JavaScript in your CSS. That's super weird, but yeah, that's old Internet Explorer for you. But it's not just Internet Explorer. You can kind of execute JavaScript using nothing but CSS in other browsers as well. Firefox, for example, used to have a bug where you could assign a background image to an element and point it to a JavaScript URL, and that script would be executed. However, it would be executed in a sandbox, so you wouldn't be able to get any data from the DOM and steal it, for example. So it was kind of secure in that way, but it would still be executed. So just by adding this line to someone's CSS, you could basically cause an attack on the site, because when someone would visit it, their browser would just crash. There would be no way for that person to view that page anymore. It's a denial of service on the client side. Yeah, that's what that looks like. Okay, so that's all I had to show you for today. I hope that you agree that CSS is actually much more powerful than it seems. And I think we have time for a quick CSS quiz before we continue with questions. So, are you guys into music? Like bands? Okay, don't be shy. I'm gonna ask some questions and you can just shout the answer if you know it, okay? So, what band is this? The Black Keys, there you go. These guys, yeah. Okay, next one, what band is this? I'm sorry? Nope. What color is that? Simply Red. Am I right? Okay, that was a bad one. What band is this? How about this one? The White Stripes, there you go. Yep. Okay, let's try a song. What song is this? Yep, Painted Black by the Rolling Stones. Like the first line of the song is, I see a red door and I want it painted black. And in CSS you can use blend modes for that. Okay, one more band. Yep, Green Day. All right. Okay, let's do one more. It's okay to guess. Like, if you don't know, just shout anything. The Spice Girls. It's not the Spice Girls. Add and Emacs and Vim and Vi and Nano. These are all editors. There you go. Maybe this band is not that well known. I don't know. Okay, one more before I go. This is the last one. Oh, that was quick. The Black Eyed Peas. Yeah, that one took me a while. Well done. There they are. Yeah. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I would also like to thank all the people whose research I've been using in this talk and whose jokes I've been stealing. So thanks. See ya.